The Duke shocked society when he married his former slave. In the autumn of 1823, the grand estate of Ravenshollow stood as a testament to centuries of noble privilege, its imposing limestone walls rising from perfectly manicured grounds that stretched as far as the eye could see. The estate commanded 3,000 acres of prime English countryside, including tenant farms that had sustained generations of Blackwood wealth. Its master, Duke Adrian Blackwood, commanded respect across England with his piercing dark eyes and raven-black hair that seemed to absorb the very light around him. At 28, he possessed a presence that could silence a room with a single glance, yet those who knew him well spoke of an unexpected compassion that lay beneath his aristocratic exterior. Adrian had inherited the dukedom at the tender age of 16 when his father died in a riding accident, forcing him to mature quickly under the iron guidance of his formidable mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Blackwood. Unlike many of his peers who squandered their inheritance on gambling and debauchery, Adrian had proven himself a capable steward of his lands and a thoughtful voice in Parliament. He had travelled extensively through Europe in his early 20s, studying agricultural innovations and social reforms that had begun to reshape the continent. These experiences had planted seeds of doubt about the rigid social structures that governed English society, though he had never voiced these doubts openly. But on this particular October morning, as mist clung to the ancient oaks that lined the estate's main drive, Adrian would encounter someone who would forever change not just his life, but the very foundation of British society. Her name was Seraphina, and she arrived at Ravenshallow's gates carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel, papers declaring her freedom, and memories of horrors that would have broken lesser spirits. The story of her arrival began 3 months earlier on the sugar plantation of Hartwell Holdings in Barbados, where she had spent the first 22 years of her life in bondage. The plantation had belonged to Adrian's great-uncle, Lord Reginald Blackwood, a man who had grown wealthy on the blood and sweat of enslaved people. When Reginald died childless and consumed by guilt over his life's work, his will had contained several shocking provisions. Among them was the manumission of 12 slaves, including Seraphina, each granted freedom and a modest sum to begin new lives wherever they chose. Seraphina had chosen England, driven by stories told by a former house slave who had spoken of a land where rain fell gently rather than in violent tropical storms, where seasons changed with predictable grace, and where, perhaps, a person might be judged by something other than the color of their skin. She had used her small inheritance to book passage on a merchant vessel, enduring weeks of seasickness and suspicious stares from crew members who wondered what a former slave was doing traveling to England with papers declaring her free. Adrian first saw her in the estate's kitchen garden, where the head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, had reluctantly assigned her temporary quarters in a small cottage originally built for the head gardener. The cottage had been empty for months since old Thomas had died, and Mrs. Whitmore, a woman of stern principle but unexpected kindness, had decided it would serve until other arrangements could be made. Seraphina knelt among the herb beds, her dark skin gleaming like polished bronze in the morning sun as she carefully tended to plants that reminded her of home. Her movements were graceful and purposeful, and when she looked up to find the Duke watching her from the garden path, she did not lower her eyes as society demanded. In that first moment of contact, Adrian was struck by something he had never encountered before. Here was a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering, who had every reason to be broken and subservient, yet she met his gaze with a dignity that seemed to radiate from her very soul. Her eyes, the color of warm amber, held depths of intelligence and strength that made him forget, momentarily, every assumption he had ever held about people of her race and former station. "Your Grace," she said, rising with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who had spent 22 years in bondage. "I am Seraphina. I believe you received word of my situation from your uncle's solicitor." Her voice carried traces of the islands where she had been born, but also the careful diction of someone who had learned to speak properly despite having no formal education. Adrian found himself studying her face, searching for the broken spirit he expected to find in someone who had endured what she had. Instead, he saw intelligence burning behind those remarkable eyes, and a strength that seemed to emanate from her very core. She was perhaps 25 years old, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, her beauty refined rather than exotic, though no less striking for its subtlety. "I did," he replied, his voice carefully neutral though his mind raced with questions. "Mrs. Whitmore has arranged for you to work in the gardens until other arrangements can be made." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the fate of a human being who had just emerged from a life of bondage. The unspoken understanding hung between them like morning mist. Society would never accept a former slave as anything more than a servant, no matter what papers she carried or what inheritance she claimed. The very fact that she was here on English soil was controversial enough, but as their gazes met in that garden, surrounded by the scent of herbs and the gentle buzz of late-season bees, neither could have imagined the storm that was about to engulf them both. That evening, as had become his custom when dealing with complex estate matters, Adrian retired to his private study with a glass of port and the latest correspondence from his land agents. The study was his sanctuary, lined from floor to ceiling with books accumulated over generations of scholarly Blackwoods, furnished with a massive oak desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on leather-bound volumes. It was here that he conducted the serious business of managing his vast holdings, here that he wrestled with the moral implications of his privileged position in an increasingly complex world. But on this night, his usual routine was shattered when he discovered he was not alone. Serafina sat in the reading chair by the window, a volume of Voltaire open in her lap, making careful notes in the margins with a quill pen she must have borrowed from his desk. She was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice his presence at first, and Adrian found himself watching in fascination as her lips moved silently, forming the words of one of philosophy's most challenging texts. "You can read," he said, though it came out as more of a question than a statement, his voice betraying the astonishment he felt. In his world, literacy among the enslaved was not just uncommon but actively prohibited. Most plantation owners considered education dangerous, likely to give slaves ideas above their station. Serafina set down the book slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. "My former master's wife taught me in secret," she explained, her voice carrying a weight of memory that made Adrian's chest tighten unexpectedly. Lady Catherine believed that education was the only thing that could never be taken away, that knowledge was the key to true freedom. Her amber eyes clouded with sadness. "I suppose she was wrong about that too, they took everything else." The simple words contained volumes of pain, and Adrian found himself wanting to know more about this woman who could discuss Voltaire's philosophy with the same ease with which she had tended his garden. "What happened to Lady Catherine?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with an informality that would have shocked anyone who knew him. "She died when I was 17, Serafina replied, her fingers tracing the edge of the book's cover. "Yellow fever. After that, things became much more difficult. Her husband, my master, discovered the books she had hidden for me, discovered that she had been teaching me letters and numbers. He was not pleased." The understatement carried such weight that Adrian felt his jaw clench involuntarily. "Yet you continued to read," he observed, noting the careful way she had been making notes, the scholarly approach she took to the text. "Could I stop? The words were already in my mind, the ideas already planted. Lady Catherine used to say that once you taste knowledge, ignorance becomes a kind of poison. I hid books wherever I could find them, read by candlelight when the overseer was drunk, memorized passages so that even if they found and destroyed the physical books, I would still have the ideas." She looked up at him then, and her eyes held a fire that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with an indomitable spirit. It was in that moment, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and privilege, that Adrian Blackwood first truly saw Serafina not as a former slave or a charity case, but as a woman whose intellect and spirit had somehow survived the unthinkable. More than that, he began to see her as someone who might challenge not just his assumptions about race and class, but his fundamental understanding of human nature itself. Their conversation that night lasted until the early hours of the morning, ranging from philosophy to literature to politics, with an ease that Adrian had never experienced with any woman of his acquaintance. Serafina possessed not just intelligence, but wisdom born of suffering, and insights that came from seeing society from its very bottom. She asked questions that made him examine his own privilege, challenged assumptions he had never thought to question, and made him see his vast estates and tenant farmers through eyes that understood what it meant to be truly powerless. When they finally parted, Adrian found himself looking forward to their next conversation with an anticipation that had nothing to do with charity or noblesse oblige, and everything to do with genuine intellectual and emotional connection. But their growing bond would soon face challenges that would test not just their feelings for each other, but their very survival in a society determined to keep them apart. The first sign of trouble came with the dawn. Mrs. Whitmore, who had been at Ravenshollow for 30 years and understood the delicate politics of managing a great estate, appeared at Adrian's breakfast table with worry lines creasing her usually serene face. "Your Grace," she began hesitantly, "I'm afraid there's been talk among the staff about Miss Serafina. Some of the younger maids are uncomfortable, working alongside someone of her background, and I've heard whispers that word has already reached the village about her presence here. Adrian set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. What sort of whispers? The usual sort, I'm afraid. Questions about why you would allow such a person to live on the estate, suggestions that your Christian charity might be misplaced. The vicar's wife made some rather pointed comments about the moral implications of housing an unmarried woman of questionable virtue. Mrs. Whitmore's distaste for village gossip was evident in her tone, but Adrian could hear the underlying concern. "And what did you tell the vicar's wife?" Adrian asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Mrs. Whitmore straighten unconsciously. "I told her that the moral character of our house guests was hardly her concern, and that if she had questions about your Grace's judgment, she was welcome to address them to you directly." Mrs. Whitmore's satisfaction with this response was evident, but she quickly sobered. "However, I fear the damage may already be done. Village gossip has a way of reaching London drawing rooms faster than the Royal Mail." Adrian's fears were confirmed the very next morning when Lord Edmund Hartwell arrived at Ravenshollow unannounced, dismounting from his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Edmund had been Adrian's closest friend since their days at Eton, sharing adventures and confidences through their youth and into adulthood. But as Edmund strode across the courtyard, his usually pleasant features set in hard lines, Adrian could see that their friendship was about to face its greatest test. "Adrian, my friend," Edmund called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard but lacking its usual warmth. "I've come as soon as I heard about your houseguest situation. We need to discuss this before it goes any further." Adrian's jaw tightened imperceptibly. In the week since Seraphina's arrival, he had found himself drawn to the gardens each morning, ostensibly to review estate matters but truthfully to continue the conversations that had begun in his library. Their discussions had evolved beyond philosophy and literature to encompass politics, social reform, and the moral contradictions of English society. Seraphina possessed a mind that challenged his own, forcing him to examine beliefs he had held since childhood and question the very foundations of the world that had shaped him. More troubling still, he had begun to look forward to these conversations with an eagerness that went beyond intellectual curiosity. He found himself thinking about her thoughtful observations throughout the day, remembering the way her eyes lit up when she encountered a new idea, treasuring the rare moments when her careful composure gave way to genuine laughter. The realization that his feelings were developing in a dangerous direction had kept him awake for several nights, wrestling with implications he hardly dared acknowledge. "Edmund," Adrian replied, extending his hand in greeting though his manner remained guarded. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Edmund's answering handshake was perfunctory, his blue eyes holding a coldness that spoke of calculation rather than friendship. "Come now, Adrian, you know exactly why I'm here. The entire town is buzzing with whispers about the Duke of Ravenshollow harboring a former slave. My sister Elena is beside herself with worry, and frankly so am I." At the mention of Elena Hartwell, Adrian's expression grew more guarded still. For 3 years, since Elena's debut into society, there had been an understanding between their families that an engagement would eventually be announced. Elena was beautiful, accomplished in all the arts deemed necessary for a lady of quality, and possessed an impeccable bloodline that would satisfy even Adrian's formidable mother. She would make an ideal duchess by every measure society cared about, bringing to the marriage connections that would strengthen the Blackwood political influence and children who would carry on the family name without the taint of scandal. The problem was that Adrian felt nothing for her beyond mild affection and genuine concern for her happiness. Their conversations never progressed beyond pleasantries and social commentary. Elena's mind, while perfectly adequate for her station, held no mysteries to intrigue him, posed no challenges to make him think differently about the world. She was everything a duke should want in a wife, and yet Adrian found himself avoiding social gatherings where he might be expected to advance their courtship. "Miss Hartwell has nothing to worry about," Adrian said carefully, though the words felt like lies even as he spoke them. "Seraphina is here temporarily as an act of Christian charity. She is my uncle's legatee entitled to safe passage and temporary shelter, nothing more." But even as the words left his mouth, Adrian knew they were becoming less true each day. His feelings for Seraphina had evolved from polite curiosity to something far more dangerous, something that threatened every assumption he had ever held about love, duty, and the proper order of society. Edmund studied his friend's face with the shrewd assessment of a man who had known him for 20 years. Adrian, I need you to understand what's at stake here. Parliament is considering new restrictions on former slaves entering Britain, specifically because of concerns about social contamination. If you're seen as harboring sympathies toward these people, it could destroy your political influence entirely. And think of Alina. She's devoted 3 years of her life to the expectation of becoming your Duchess. You can't simply abandon that commitment for a moment of misplaced compassion. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Edmund pressing every argument he could muster about duty, social responsibility, and the practical consequences of Adrian's choices. But even as Adrian nodded and made appropriate responses, his mind kept returning to Serafina, to their conversations that made him feel more alive than any social gathering ever had, to the way she looked at him with eyes that saw through every pretense to the man he truly was beneath his title and wealth. That afternoon, as if summoned by the weight of expectations and social pressure, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Blackwood arrived at Ravenshollow in a flurry of black silk and aristocratic fury. Her carriage, pulled by 4 matched greys and bearing the Blackwood coat of arms, swept up the drive with an imperious display that announced her mood before she even stepped foot in the house. At 55, she remained a formidable woman whose word was law throughout the county, whose approval could make or break a social season, and whose displeasure was something even her powerful son had learned to avoid. Margaret Blackwood had been born to nobility, married into greater nobility, and had spent 40 years mastering the intricate politics of high society. Her silver hair was pulled back severely in a style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her grey eyes, and her bearing conveyed the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted her place in the world or her right to judge others. She had guided Adrian through the treacherous waters of his early inheritance with skill and determination, ensuring that he emerged as a respected voice in Parliament and a catch worthy of any ambitious mother's daughter. Adrian, she announced upon her arrival, sweeping into the main hall with the drama of an avenging angel, this madness ends today. The confrontation that followed took place in Adrian's study, with Mrs. Whitmore dismissed and the doors firmly closed against curious servants. Margaret had clearly done her research with the thoroughness that had made her such a formidable political ally, producing documents that detailed every aspect of Serafina's past with ruthless precision. Her name is Serafina Catherine Morrison, Margaret began, consulting a leather portfolio with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Born 1801 on the Hartwell plantation in Barbados to a house slave named Mary and an unknown father, likely the plantation owner or one of his overseers. Purchased at age 7 when her mother died of consumption and transferred to field work until age 15, when she was brought into the main house. Adrian's hands clenched into fists as he listened, forcing himself to remain silent while his mother recited the clinical details of a childhood that should never have been endured by any human being. Each fact she presented painted a picture of systematic dehumanization that made his earlier anger seem pale by comparison. The records show multiple attempts at escape, Margaret continued relentlessly, each resulting in severe punishment according to plantation discipline. At 18, she was assigned as personal servant to the plantation owner's wife, Lady Catherine Morrison, who apparently took an inappropriate interest in her education. Mother enough, Adrian's voice carried a warning that would have silenced most people, but Margaret Blackwood had not survived 40 years in high society by being easily intimidated. No, Adrian, not nearly enough. Do you know what happened when Lady Catherine died of fever? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Thomas Mitchell, the plantation overseer, took a particular interest in young Serafina. The records are quite specific about the nature of that interest and about what happened in the overseer's quarters during the long months before your uncle's death and her subsequent manumission. The implication hit Adrian like a physical blow, filling him with a rage so pure it threatened to consume all rational thought. He had wondered about the careful way Serafina sometimes positioned herself in rooms, always with her back to a wall and a clear path to the door. He had noticed how she flinched when approached unexpectedly, how she maintained a careful distance from all the male servants despite their obvious respect for her dignity and intelligence. Now he understood why, and the knowledge filled him with a desire to track down Thomas Mitchell and beat him to death with his bare hands. "She is not responsible for what was done to her," he said, his voice deadly quiet but vibrating with barely controlled fury. "Of course not," Margaret replied smoothly, setting aside her papers with calculated precision. "But society will never see it that way. She is damaged goods, Adrian, tainted by experiences that make her unsuitable for decent company. And if you continue this association, you will be tainted as well. Your reputation, your political career, your family's honor, all of it will be destroyed for the sake of a woman who can never be anything more than a mistress, and a scandalous one at that." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Adrian knew his mother was right about society's judgment, understood the political and social consequences of continuing his association with Serafina, but he also knew that walking away from her now would be a betrayal not just of her, but of everything he believed about justice, human dignity, and the possibility of love transcending the artificial boundaries that divided their world. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice hollow with the weight of impossible choices. "Send her away," Margaret replied immediately, quietly, generously, but permanently. "Give her enough money to establish herself somewhere far from here, perhaps in the American territories where such connections are less remarkable. Announce your engagement to Elena Hartwell within the month. Restore order to your life before this situation destroys everything our family has built." That evening, after his mother had retired to her chambers with the satisfaction of having delivered her ultimatum clearly, Adrian found Serafina in the library once again, but this time she wasn't reading. She sat by the tall windows that overlooked the gardens where they had first met, her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Even in profile, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself as if prepared to flee at any moment. "You heard," he said softly, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. She nodded without turning around, her voice steady despite the pain he could hear beneath its careful control. "Your mother was not particularly concerned with privacy when she spoke to Mrs. Whitmore about the arrangements for my departure. The entire household knows now what I was before I came here, what was done to me, and what my presence here means for your reputation." Adrian studied her profile in the lamplight, noting the way she had closed herself off emotionally, building walls that made her seem untouchable despite their growing intimacy over the past weeks. "What you are doesn't define what you are," he said, echoing words he had spoken before, but with greater conviction now that he understood the full extent of what she had survived. For the first time since he had known her, Serafina's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability she worked so hard to hide. "Doesn't it? I was property, Your Grace, bought and sold and used like livestock for 22 years. That is what I was, and it is what I will always be in the eyes of the world, your world." "Not in my eyes." The words came out with more force than he had intended, carrying implications that both thrilled and terrified him. Serafina turned to look at him then, and her amber eyes were bright with unshed tears that she was too proud to let fall. "What do your eyes matter against the judgment of society? Against your mother's expectations, your political career, your duty to marry well and produce heirs worthy of your name? I'm a former slave with no family, no fortune, no connections that could benefit you. Even if your feelings are genuine, even if mine are the same, what future could we possibly have together?" The question hung between them, charged with implications that neither was prepared to fully acknowledge, but both understood perfectly. In that moment, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and privilege, Adrian realized that he was facing the most important decision of his life. He could choose duty, respectability, and the safe path that society expected of him. Or he could choose love, scandal, and a future that neither of them could predict or control. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his voice rough with emotion, "the question isn't what future society would allow us, but what future we might create for ourselves." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but as their gazes met in the lamplight, something shifted irrevocably between them. The careful distance they had maintained began to crumble, replaced by a connection that transcended every boundary society had erected between them. It was in that moment that Adrian Blackwood realized he was not just falling in love with Serafina, but that he was willing to fight the entire world to keep her. But their declaration, spoken in whispers and sealed with tentative touches, would soon face challenges that would test not just their feelings, but their very right to exist in the same world. The first snow of winter had begun to fall when Thomas Mitchell arrived at Ravenshollow, and with him came the ghosts of Serafina's past made flesh. Mitchell was a large man with sun-weathered skin and cold grey eyes that seemed to evaluate everything and everyone in terms of possession and value. His clothes marked him as colonial gentry, well-made but unfashionable by London standards, and he carried himself with the casual brutality of someone who had spent years exercising absolute power over other human beings. He had sailed from Barbados specifically to retrieve what he considered his property, armed with documents that claimed Serafina owed substantial debts that voided her freedom papers. The documents were forgeries, but sophisticated ones crafted by corrupt colonial officials who were willing to bend the law for sufficient compensation. Mitchell had also brought with him sworn testimony from plantation witnesses, all carefully coached to support his claims, and letters from influential Barbados planters who vouched for his character and legal standing. Adrian was in his study reviewing correspondence from his land agents when Mrs. Whitmore announced the visitor with obvious distress, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks that revealed her deep concern. "Your Grace, there's a man here claiming legal ownership of Miss Serafina. He says he has documents from the colonial courts and demands her immediate surrender." The blood in Adrian's veins turned to ice, and he felt the same protective rage that had consumed him during his mother's revelations about Serafina's past. Over the past month, his feelings for her had deepened beyond mere attraction or intellectual fascination into something that consumed his thoughts during the day and haunted his dreams at night. He found himself counting the hours until their evening conversations, treasuring the rare moments when her careful composure gave way to genuine laughter, and lying awake at night tortured by the knowledge of what she had endured and his own inability to erase those memories. Their relationship had evolved carefully, with both of them aware of the dangerous ground they were treading. They had progressed from formal conversations to genuine intimacy, sharing thoughts and feelings that neither had ever revealed to another person. Adrian had told her about the loneliness of his position, the weight of responsibilities he had inherited so young, and his growing doubts about the society that had shaped him. Serafina had shared memories of her childhood before slavery, dreams she had nurtured during her darkest hours, and her struggle to maintain hope in a world designed to crush her spirit. More significantly, they had begun to touch, tentatively and carefully but with growing boldness. A hand briefly placed on a shoulder during an emotional conversation, fingers brushing as they shared a book, stolen moments in the garden when Adrian would offer his arm as they walked among the herb beds. Each contact was electric, charged with the awareness of how forbidden their attraction was and how dangerous its consequences might be. Mitchell presented his case in the main drawing room with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged, laying out his documents with theatrical precision and speaking in the measured tones of someone reciting a well-rehearsed speech. "Your Grace," he began, his voice carrying the flat vowels of colonial English, "I appreciate your Christian charity in sheltering this woman, but she belongs to the Morrison estate in Barbados. Her freedom papers were obtained fraudulently through the influence of my former employer's guilt-ridden widow, and she owes substantial debts for her upkeep, education, and medical care over the years. These debts legally void any claim to manumission and require her return to satisfy her obligations." Adrian studied the documents with growing fury, his legal training from Cambridge allowing him to spot the inconsistencies and anachronisms that marked them as forgeries. But he also understood that colonial courts, where testimony from former slaves held little weight and white witnesses commanded automatic respect, would likely accept Mitchell's claims without serious investigation. "These papers are fabricated," Adrian said flatly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mitchell's smile was predatory, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use. "Perhaps your Grace is too close to the situation to judge objectively. I understand that certain attachments can cloud a gentleman's judgment, particularly when the object of that attachment is skilled in the arts of pleasing men. Serafina was always remarkably talented in that regard." The threat was clear and multifaceted. Mitchell knew about Adrian's feelings for Serafina, and he was prepared to use that knowledge to destroy both their reputations if necessary. More than that, his crude implications about Serafina's supposed sexual skills were designed to humiliate her and reduce her to nothing more than a courtesan in Adrian's eyes. Adrian rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, his dark eyes fixed on Mitchell with an intensity that made the overseer take an unconscious step backward. "You will speak of Miss Serafina with respect, or you will find yourself removed from my property in a manner that will leave lasting impressions." But Mitchell had not survived years in the brutal world of colonial plantation management by being easily intimidated. "Your Grace, I admire your protective instincts, but you must understand the legal realities. I have valid documents from properly constituted colonial authorities. If you refuse to surrender her voluntarily, I am prepared to involve British magistrates and, if necessary, appeal directly to Parliament." The current political climate regarding former slaves and their legal status would, I believe, favor my position substantially. That evening, as word of Mitchell's arrival spread through the household with the speed of wildfire, Adrian found Serafina packing her meager belongings with mechanical precision. Her face was a mask of calm resignation that broke his heart more than tears would have, revealing the steel core that had sustained her through 22 years of bondage and abuse. She had laid out her few dresses with careful attention to detail, folded her undergarments with practiced efficiency, and placed her precious books in a separate bundle that spoke to her priorities even in crisis. "You're not going with him," Adrian said, his voice brooking no argument as he stepped into her small chamber without regard for propriety. "I must," she replied without looking up from her packing, her movements never faltering despite the emotion he could hear beneath her controlled tone. "You've already risked too much for me. Your mother is right about the scandal, Edmund is right about the political consequences, and now Mitchell threatens legal action that could destroy not just your reputation but your freedom. I won't be responsible for your ruin." "I don't care about my reputation," Adrian said, moving closer until he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes. Serafina finally looked at him, and her amber eyes were filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass centuries of suffering. "But I do care about yours. I care about your happiness, your future, and your right to live without scandal. You're a good man, Adrian, the best I've ever known. You've shown me kindness I never dared hope for, treated me with respect I never thought I deserved, and made me feel like a woman rather than property for the first time in my life. I won't be the reason you lose everything your family has built." The confession hung between them, revealing feelings that both had been afraid to acknowledge fully even to themselves. Adrian could see the love in her eyes, mixed with determination to sacrifice her own happiness for his welfare, and the combination nearly brought him to his knees. It was then that Adrian made a decision that would shock society to its very foundations, a choice that would define the rest of their lives and challenge the very structure of English nobility. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his despite the impropriety, despite the scandal it would cause if they were discovered, despite every rule of conduct that had governed his life since childhood. "Marry me," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion and absolute conviction. Serafina stared at him in stunned silence, her amber eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "Adrian, you cannot mean—" "I mean every word," he interrupted, his grip on her hands tightening as if he could will her to accept through touch alone. "Marry me and Mitchell's claims become meaningless. You'll be the Duchess of Ravenshollow, beyond the reach of any colonial court or fabricated document. As my wife, you'll have protections that no overseer or magistrate would dare challenge." "The scandal would ruin you," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to maintain control. "Your mother would disown you, society would ostracize you, and your political career would be destroyed. Everything you've worked for, everything your family represents, would be lost for the sake of a former slave who brings nothing to the marriage but shame." "Then let it all burn," Adrian said fiercely, his dark eyes blazing with conviction that seemed to illuminate the small room. "I would rather be ruined with you than honored without you. I would rather face scandal as your husband than live respectably as anyone else's. You are not nothing, Serafina. You are everything: intelligence, courage, beauty, strength, and a heart that has somehow remained capable of love despite every cruelty inflicted upon it. You are worth more than every title, every estate, every political connection I possess." The proposal sent shockwaves through the household with the force of an earthquake, and within hours the news had spread beyond Ravenshallow's boundaries to the village, the county, and ultimately to London itself. Servants whispered in amazement, tenants gathered in clusters to discuss the unprecedented situation, and messages began flying along the roads carrying word of the Duke's scandalous announcement to every corner of English society. Edmund Hartwell arrived the next morning in a fury that bordered on violence, his horse lathered from hard riding and his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by haste and emotion. He was accompanied by Elena, whose tears and reproaches filled the air with dramatic suffering that seemed designed more for effect than from genuine grief. Elena had always possessed a talent for turning emotional scenes into theatrical performances, and she deployed that skill now with devastating effectiveness. "Adrian, this is absolute madness," Edmund raged, pacing the length of the drawing room like a caged animal. "You'll be ostracized from every decent household in England. Your political career will be destroyed before it truly begins. The Prince Regent himself will cut you socially, and every door that has ever been opened to you will slam shut. And think of Elena, you've led her to expect a proposal for 3 years, allowed her to plan a future that now lies in ruins. Elena herself was more direct in her approach, deploying weapons of guilt and wounded femininity with the precision of a military strategist. "How could you do this to me, Adrian?" she demanded, her beauty marred by the ugly twist of entitlement and self-pity. "How could you throw away everything we planned, everything we dreamed of, for some colonial slave who probably seduced you with methods learned in the overseer's quarters? Don't you see that she's using you, manipulating your noble nature for her own advancement?" The insults continued for over an hour, with Edmund and Elena taking turns attacking both Adrian's judgment and Serafina's character. They spoke of duty and responsibility, of family honor and social expectations, of the practical impossibility of a successful marriage between a duke and a former slave. Every argument was designed to make Adrian question his decision, to force him to see reason and abandon what they characterized as a moment of temporary madness. It was Serafina who ended the confrontation, stepping into the drawing room with a dignity that made Elena's hysteria seem grotesque by comparison. She wore a simple day dress of blue wool that Mrs. Whitmore had provided, but she carried herself like a queen facing hostile courtiers. Her amber eyes were steady, her posture erect, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that silenced the room. "I never asked for any of this, Miss Hartwell," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "I never asked to fall in love with your intended husband, never sought to disrupt your plans or cause you pain. But if you cannot see the man you claim to love making a choice based on his own conscience rather than society's expectations, then perhaps you never truly knew him at all." The confrontation that followed was brutal in its intensity and devastating in its consequences. Elena collapsed into renewed sobs, Edmund threatened to call Adrian out for the insult to his family's honor, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared with the news that the Dowager Duchess was approaching in her carriage, having received word of the morning's events through the mysterious network that kept the aristocracy informed of each other's scandals. Margaret Blackwood's arrival was like the coming of a winter storm, bringing with it an atmosphere of doom and barely controlled fury. She swept into the drawing room in full formal dress despite the early hour, her silver hair arranged with military precision and her grey eyes holding the cold fire of absolute authority. Behind her came her personal secretary carrying portfolios of documents, and her lady's maid bearing what appeared to be formal legal papers. "Adrian," she announced without preamble, "you will end this farce immediately, or I will invoke every legal measure available to protect our family's reputation. I have already consulted with our solicitors regarding the process of declaring you mentally incompetent, and I have drafted letters to every significant political figure in England explaining that you are suffering from a temporary illness that has impaired your judgment." The threat was both shocking and entirely believable. Margaret Blackwood possessed the connections and determination to make good on her promise, and the legal precedents existed for declaring an heir mentally unfit if his behavior threatened family interests. Adrian could see his entire future hanging in the balance, his freedom, his estates, his ability to make his own choices, and ultimately his chance for happiness with Serafina. But even as the walls closed in around him, Adrian felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in his life, he was facing a choice based purely on love rather than duty, acting from his heart rather than his head, and the clarity of that purpose gave him strength he had never known he possessed. Mitchell, who had been waiting in the background like a vulture circling carrion, chose this moment to play his final card. "Perhaps there's another solution that might satisfy everyone concerned," he suggested smoothly, his voice carrying the oily confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "The woman could return with me voluntarily, sparing your grace and his family this embarrassment. I'm prepared to be generous in my treatment of her, understanding as I do the attachment that has developed. She would be well cared for, properly housed, and given appropriate work suited to her abilities." The look that passed between Mitchell and Serafina revealed the true horror of her past and the future he was promising. Adrian saw her flinch, saw the terror she couldn't quite hide, saw the way her hands trembled before she clenched them into fists at her sides. In Mitchell's words, he heard the promise of renewed sexual slavery disguised as generosity, the threat of systematic abuse wrapped in the language of civilized behavior. Something inside Adrian snapped with the force of a breaking dam, releasing a flood of protective fury that transformed him from English gentleman to something far more primal and dangerous. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made even his formidable mother step backward. "Get out," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "All of you, Mitchell, Edmund, mother, you have 1 hour to remove yourselves from my property before I have you thrown out bodily. Elena, you may remain long enough to compose yourself, but then you too must go. This is my house, my decision, and my life. I will not be threatened, manipulated, or coerced into abandoning the woman I love." As the room erupted in shocked protests and threats, Adrian turned to Serafina and saw something in her eyes that made everything else fade into insignificance. It was wonder, mixed with fear and love and desperate hope, the expression of a woman who had never dared believe that someone might fight for her against impossible odds. "You would truly give up everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would give up everything false for something real," he replied, reaching for her hands despite the audience of shocked onlookers. "You are the only truth I've found in a world full of beautiful lies." But their victory was short-lived, and their celebration would have to wait. That night, as they made quiet plans for a ceremony that might shield them from the worst of society's reaction, word came from London that would test their love in ways neither had imagined possible. The message arrived at dawn, delivered by a rider who had pushed his horse through the night and nearly killed the animal in his haste. The parchment bore the seal of Parliament and contained news that struck like a physical blow. Emergency legislation had been passed overnight, specifically designed to prevent Adrian's marriage to Serafina. The Colonial Persons Restriction Act had been rushed through both houses of Parliament in a single session, orchestrated by powerful forces who saw their union as a direct threat to the established social order. The law retroactively invalidated any marriages between British nobility and former colonial slaves, stripped such persons of legal protections their freedom papers might have provided, and subjected them to immediate deportation upon demand by any person with valid colonial claims to their service. Adrian read the document with growing disbelief and rage, his hands trembling as he absorbed the implications of what had been done. The law not only prevented their marriage, but also made Serafina vulnerable to seizure and deportation without legal recourse. Effectively, she was once again considered property, subject to removal by anyone with the proper documentation. "They mean to destroy us both," Adrian said, his voice hollow with the magnitude of their enemies' reach and determination. "They've changed the very law to prevent our happiness." Serafina took the document from him with steady hands, reading it with the same careful attention she had once given to Voltaire, but her face remained remarkably calm. When she looked up, her amber eyes held not despair but the fierce intelligence that had first attracted him. "Then we must be cleverer than they are," she said quietly, moving to the map of his estates that hung on the study wall. "There is one place their laws cannot reach us, one sanctuary that predates their authority by centuries." It was Serafina herself who proposed the solution that would cement their legend in history, her finger tracing the boundaries of land that had belonged to the Blackwood family since before Parliament existed. The chapel at Ravenshollow was built in 1203, before any modern government held sway over England. It has rights of sanctuary that predate parliamentary authority, operates under ecclesiastical law that has never been formally revoked. If we marry there, under ancient church traditions, their emergency legislation cannot touch us. The plan was audacious, legally questionable and politically dangerous, but it offered their only hope of remaining together. Adrian's family chapel had been built during the reign of King John, established with privileges granted by papal authority that superseded secular law. A marriage performed there by a priest willing to invoke ancient traditions and ecclesiastical immunity could potentially supersede even the most recent parliamentary legislation. Finding such a priest proved easier than expected, though not without its own emotional complications. Father Benedict, the elderly chaplain who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, had watched Adrian grow from a privileged boy into a man of conscience. When Adrian explained their desperate situation, the old priest's eyes showed understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. "Your Grace," Father Benedict said with the slight smile of a man who had spent decades watching the powerful struggle with their consciences, "I have served God and this family my entire adult life. If the Almighty has brought you to love this woman, if He has given you the courage to challenge unjust laws and social prejudices, then no act of Parliament can stand against divine will. I will marry you under the ancient rites, and let any man who would separate what God has joined together explain himself to his Creator." But their enemies were moving with equal determination and greater resources. Mitchell, backed by parliamentary authority and Edmund Hartwell's growing influence, had obtained court orders from multiple jurisdictions demanding Serafina's immediate surrender. He arrived at Ravenshollow with local magistrates, a warrant from the Colonial Office, and a crowd of supporters who had come to witness what they assumed would be the Duke's humiliation and surrender. The confrontation began in the pre-dawn darkness, with Mitchell's forces surrounding the chapel just as Father Benedict prepared to begin the wedding ceremony. Adrian, resplendent in formal dress despite the extraordinary circumstances, stood beside Serafina at the altar that had witnessed 3 centuries of Blackwood family ceremonies. She wore a simple white gown that Mrs. Whitmore had somehow procured from her own wedding chest, and a veil that had belonged to Adrian's grandmother, transforming her from former slave to radiant bride despite the drama surrounding them. "Your Grace," called the lead magistrate through the chapel's ancient oak doors, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority, "you are harboring property claimed under lawful warrant. Surrender the woman or face arrest for obstruction of justice and violation of parliamentary statute." Father Benedict raised his voice to carry beyond the walls, his words echoing with the authority of centuries of church law. "This is consecrated ground, operating under ecclesiastical law that predates your authority by 6 centuries. You have no power here, no jurisdiction over sacraments performed under papal authority and divine blessing." What followed was a standoff that would be remembered and debated for generations. Outside, Mitchell and the magistrates demanded entry, supported by a growing crowd of local gentry, curious villagers, and opportunistic scandal seekers who had come to witness what they assumed would be either a dramatic surrender or an equally dramatic arrest. Inside, Father Benedict continued the marriage ceremony with unshakable determination, his voice carrying clearly through the stone walls as he pronounced words that would bind Adrian and Serafina before God and history. "Do you, Adrian James Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in prosperity and adversity, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others until death do you part?" Adrian's voice rang out with conviction that silenced the crowd outside, carrying clearly through the chapel and beyond its walls to the assembled witnesses of their unprecedented union. "I do, before God and all present, with my whole heart and soul." "Do you, Serafina Catherine, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in prosperity and adversity, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others until death do you part?" Serafina's voice rose like a bell, clear and strong, and filled with the joy of a woman who had found not just love but her own unshakable sense of worth. "I do, with gratitude to God and with all the love I possess." The crowd outside fell into stunned silence as Father Benedict pronounced them husband and wife under the ancient rites of holy matrimony. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, not parliament, not magistrate, not king or emperor. This union is blessed by divine authority that supersedes all earthly power." As Adrian and Serafina kissed, sealing their union before the altar where his ancestors had worshipped for generations, the chapel doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the sacred space. Mitchell stormed in with the magistrates at his heels, only to stop short at the sight that greeted them. The Duke and his bride stood hand in hand before the altar, legally married under laws older than England itself, surrounded by the symbols of ancient authority that rendered modern legislation meaningless. Behind them, Father Benedict held the marriage register with their signatures clearly visible, while Mrs. Whitmore and several loyal servants served as witnesses to the ceremony that had just transformed a former slave into one of the most powerful women in England. "You're too late," Adrian said simply, his arm protective around his new wife's waist. "She is now the Duchess of Ravenshollow, married under ecclesiastical law that your colonial warrants cannot touch. Any attempt to harm or remove her constitutes an attack on the nobility itself and will be treated as treason against the crown." The legal implications were staggering and immediately apparent to everyone present. As a duchess, Serafina now possessed protections that superseded any colonial claim or parliamentary restriction. Mitchell's carefully prepared documents were worthless against her new title, and any attempt to harm her would indeed constitute an attack on the highest levels of British society. The magistrates, suddenly understanding the political earthquake they were witnessing, began to withdraw quietly, unwilling to become caught in the constitutional crisis that was rapidly developing. Mitchell's face contorted with rage and frustration, his years of planning and preparation reduced to nothing by a ceremony that had taken less than an hour to complete. But he was powerless against the combination of ancient law, religious authority, and noble privilege that now protected the woman he had traveled across an ocean to reclaim. But the most profound change was not in the legal documents or social protocols, but in Serafina herself. As she turned to face the crowd that had gathered to see her humiliated, She stood with the bearing of a woman who had found not just love and protection, but her own unshakable sense of dignity and worth. "I was born into slavery," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chapel and beyond to the assembled witnesses. "I lived as property for 22 years, bought and sold and used without regard for my humanity. But today I claim not just my freedom, but my dignity, my intelligence, my right to love and be loved in return, and my place as an equal partner in a union blessed by God Himself." The words carried such power and conviction that even hostile witnesses found themselves moved despite their prejudices. Here was a woman who had transcended every limitation society had tried to impose, who had transformed herself from victim to victor through courage, intelligence, and the transformative power of love. The years that followed their dramatic wedding were indeed difficult, filled with social ostracism, political attacks, and constant scrutiny from those who could never accept what they had done. Many doors that had once been open to Adrian slammed shut permanently, and invitations that had once arrived regularly ceased entirely. Old friends crossed streets to avoid acknowledging them, and business associates found excuses to end profitable relationships. But they also discovered unexpected allies among progressive nobles and reformers who saw their marriage as a symbol of hope for a more just society. Writers and philosophers sought them out, curious about the woman whose intelligence had captured a duke's heart, and impressed with her thoughtful contributions to discussions of social reform and human rights. Foreign dignitaries, less constrained by English prejudices, welcomed them warmly when they travelled abroad. Serafina proved herself a duchess worthy of the title in every respect, using her position to advocate for abolition and educational reforms with a passion born of personal experience. She established schools for the children of former slaves and working-class families, turning Ravenshollow into a beacon of progressive thought that attracted visitors from across Europe and America. Her salon became famous for its intellectual discourse, bringing together minds that might never have met in traditional social settings. Adrian's political career, far from being destroyed, took on new dimensions as he became a leading voice for social reform in Parliament. His speeches on abolition carried moral authority that his previous positions had lacked, informed by personal understanding of what slavery truly meant. Together, they challenged the very foundations of the society that had tried to keep them apart, using their combined influence to push for changes that would benefit generations of oppressed people. Their personal happiness grew stronger with each passing year, validated by the birth of 3 children who inherited both their parents' intelligence and their determination to make the world more just. The children faced their own challenges as mixed-race aristocrats in a prejudiced society, but they also possessed advantages that allowed them to become leaders in their own right. 25 years after their scandalous wedding, as they sat together in the garden where they had first met, Serafina reflected on the journey that had brought them from that first tentative conversation to a love that had literally changed the law. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her hair now touched with silver but her amber eyes still holding that same fire that had captivated him decades before. "The scandal, the ostracism, the battles we've had to fight." Adrian took her hand, noting how it bore the calluses of both slavery and noble work, how it told the story of a woman who had transcended every limitation society had tried to impose while using her privilege to lift others. "My only regret," he said, "is that it took me so long to understand that love recognizes no boundaries except those we create for ourselves." Their marriage had indeed shocked society to its very foundations, but in the end, it had also transformed it in ways neither had dared imagine. They proved that love, when backed by courage and conviction, could overcome any obstacle, even the deeply entrenched prejudices of an empire built on the subjugation of others. If you enjoyed this story of love conquering impossible odds, please give it a like, subscribe for more historical tales, and share it with others who believe in the power of love to change the world.